Here we are. Good evening and good evening. And oh my goodness, we navigated all the way from the Abla down here in various different ways that got here. We are in either the thick or the height of the fall season. I personally feel like I'm on a carousel ride going around. For those of you that were watching sort of the coming lineup of things, that carousel ride doesn't stop for quite a bit, from lectures to art chatter. And Sunday night until midnight, we hosted the Tallgrass Film Festival closing party here. It's been a carousel ride. To say nothing of a really gangbuster head count for school tours here. So thanks to Courtney Spousta at the back of our room, our curator of education, who figures out how to bring all these kids through here. I'm happy to share with all of you that it's pretty clear this year, for attendance overall at the Art Museum, we will crest 80,000 people here, which from 50,000 to 80,000 is great, and it is more than the year that we had Monet de Matisse. I'm not sure how that. So the staff are practically sleeping here. But before we get into introductions and before we start the program this evening, I want to take just really half a minute to acknowledge and thank all of you in the room, because you are Murdock Society members and you're part of this because we love being together, we love the camaraderie, we love the friendship, and the speakers that we get are they expand our minds. That's all important. But you're a member as well because of everything that the Art Museum brings to the city. So I hope your heart grows just, an extra dimension to hear that our attendance is doing so well. Your support, your membership, helps us realize the ambition of our mission and helps bring all these school kids who've never been to a museum before. Hopefully or possibly, a good number of you in the room do not realize we give free bus reimbursement. So if the reason that you're not coming to the Art Museum is because of the cost of your school bus, you help us do that. So thank you. And in fact, a really shining example of why that's important is the person who is going to take this podium in a minute or two. You just never know when a youngster will come to the Art Museum and be touched and transformed in some way. It's exposure to art and artists in Wichita that redirected or directed the life of Keith Jacobshagen for his calling as an artist. Because Keith is a Wichita native. He is a proud Hyde Elementary, Robinson Middle School, and East High graduate. And then he went off to, he has a BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute. He has a Master's of Fine Art from the University of Kansas. And many know Robert Sudlow. I think we had a glorious installation of Keith's painting upstairs in the Obla Gallery that was side by side by two Robert Sudlows. Robert Sudlow, who taught painting at the University of Kansas, was a teacher and mentor to Keith. So when we told him that we proudly got your painting out, and by the way, we put it by Sudlow, he was really pleased by that. In 1968, Keith took the teaching job that helped put bread and butter on the table while growing as an artist, not in Kansas, but at the University of Nebraska, and he retired from there recently and lives with his artist wife, Paula Day, who's here at the front of the auditorium. Want to acknowledge her as well. Often when I'm here and sharing a background or information about someone and an artist, I will talk about what makes them prestigious. and gallery representation and museum exhibitions for the artist. And I could do that for Keith, and you would find it really most impressive. He's been in any museum exhibition in decades that was about landscape of the heart of the country and the plains. Keith was always the top of our list. But I want to talk about something else for Keith because I think it's significant, and I think it's going to deepen understanding of the work that he's going to share with us. So I'm an early American modernist myself, and Paul Cézanne is always this important touchstone for that generation or so. And there are ways that a comparison between Keith Jacobshagen and Paul Cézanne makes some important sense. Both artists made a lifelong commitment to landscape. Both turned their back on reputation and fame, and yet both reputation and fame found these two artists. Both lived and concentrated on the region of their birth, France, the south of France for Cézanne, and with us in the heartland, the Midwest prairie for Keith. And yet neither was actually a realist. The subject of the land was not their, the land is not their subject per se. Instead, it's really the unique perceptions that one has of landscape and what I will call a poetry of place. So poetry, it's really an incisive concentration on a particular small detail, and that detail then becomes laden with richer meaning that is larger and more expansive. And for a poet, for an artist, that requires, I think, an uncanny ability for careful perception, and really an acuity to be able to translate something that you see and feel into a work of art. And Keith Jacobshagen has that in spades and over again. So I have a quote to end my introduction. To paint from nature is not to copy what is objective. It's to realize one's sensations. I think Keith could have written that quote, but it was actually Paul Cézanne. Please help me to welcome Keith back to his hometown of Wichita and to the podium.
I think it took my notes. Oh, thank you all for coming. Yes, born and raised in Wichita, and I loved every minute of it. I didn't leave Wichita for good until I was in my early 20s and ended up at University of Kansas, the Kansas City Art Institute. Studied there as a graphic designer and an illustrator with a very specific interest also in painting. And studied with a guy by the name of Wilbur Newall, who I don't know if you people know Wilbur, but you certainly know Bob Sudlow probably from the University of Kansas. And I went there for grad school, and my life changed after meeting Bob Sudlow. He just opened up this whole sense of how important the space and the light of the Midwest was something that one might pursue. And I started painting with him, going out with him. I have a very strong memory of standing in a field with Bob, probably in early March. I was maybe 25 yards away, but positioned so I was kind of a little bit behind him and I could see what he was doing. And it was a lovely day. It was probably in the 60s, and the wind suddenly switched around from the north and started blowing, and the temperature started falling, and it started snowing. And I started packing up, and I looked over, and Bob's just got this big grin on his face, sitting painting away. And he saw that I was beginning to pack up, and he said, "Where the hell are you going?" So I put my painting back on my little French easel and did my best, and probably painted one of my really interesting paintings at that time of my life. And because of the weather, because of the discomfort of the weather, I painted a painting that was as much about the formal qualities of the landscape, shape, form, distance, and light, as I might not have done if it had been 65, 70 degrees and no wind. Because the nature itself gave me this sense of pursuit that I don't think I had ever really experienced it under more comfortable conditions. So right now I think Bob Sudlow, I think of him almost every day. And it was so nice to see the Sudlow paintings upstairs, and then to see my painting next to Bob's. I felt extremely proud of that. I'm going to read a few quotes, and you're going to stare at that painting for a while. and then we'll move on, and I'll show some images and pursue talking about those images. And I'll do my best to try to explain something that is, I think, for most artists, unexplainable. But we all try. And when I took a teaching position, that's when I really had to try. I had to go beyond just talking about the mixture of the palette, the kind of brushes that the student might use, the way that they might pursue this act of either inventing a painting out of nothing or painting directly from a still life or a landscape. And it was an incredibly exciting 10 years of my life where I was learning along with my students, and it felt so good that I kept on, and I retired after 40 years of teaching at the University of Nebraska. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes, and then I'll talk a little bit about sort of what got me started. Once in a life, a man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience, to look at it from as many angles as he can, to wonder about it, to dwell upon it. He ought to imagine that he touches it with his hands, at every season, and listens to the sounds that are made on it. He ought to imagine the creatures there and the faintest motions of the wind. He ought to recollect the glare of noon and all the colors of dawn and dusk. Scott Amadei. Quote from Gretel Ehrlich. To see and know a place is a contemplative act. It means emptying our minds and letting what is there in all its multiplicity and endless variety come in. A quote from John C. Van Camp from Prairie and Rocky Mountain Adventures. There is no describing the prairies. They are like the ocean in more than one particular, but in none more than this. The other impossibility of producing any just impression of them by description. They inspire feelings so unique, so distant from anything else, so powerful yet vague and indefinite as to defy description while they invite the attempt. Walt Whitman. As to scenery, giving my own thought and feeling, while I know the standard claim is that Yosemite, Niagara Falls in the upper Yellowstone, and the like afford the greatest natural shows, I'm not so sure, but the prairies and the plains, while less stunning at first sight, last longer, fill the aesthetic sense fuller, precede all the rest, and make North America's characteristic landscape, even the prairie's simplest statistics, are sublime. And finally, quoting Socrates, I was a university professor. I have to quote Socrates. An unexamined life is not worth living. And I have to say that I do believe in that. And I've tried to practice that certainly for 40 years or more. When I began to become interested in making images, there were some people here in Wichita who made a huge difference to me in my life. They're all gone now, and I don't know if people would remember them at all, but I have to put their names out there in the audience to give you a sense that locally I had mentors that were really extraordinary. First was a man by the name of Rex Hall. He taught at Southeast High School. Do you know Rex? You guys? Good. Excellent. Rex would, when we would be working on, the art students would be working on scenery and stuff down the basement, Rex would let us smoke. And just made us feel so grown up. He also had a just sort of a wonderfully peculiar personality, and he would continually surprise us with the words that would come out of his mouth, and oftentimes the things that he would say you wouldn't quite understand until maybe a week or 2 weeks later, and then all of a sudden you'd be working and you would say, oh yeah, this is about, I got to remember, this is about space, even though I'm using a material that's flat, which is the picture plane of the canvas or the paper that you're drawing on. And that you're committing yourself to this bizarre miracle to trick everybody out there that comes to look at it and believing that they're looking at a landscape. And maybe they're even looking at a landscape that is truly important to them, that somehow has a very deep and rich feeling. In 1964, in 63, I'd gone out to the West Coast to study at a place called Art Center College of Design. I had a real desire to be an illustrator, and I was one of those kids that would lie on the evening, lie on the living room floor, and my father would be, reading Saturday Evening Post, and I'd lie on the floor, and I'd go through Saturday Evening Post to the back magazines and issues and look at the illustrations. And even at a tender age of, say, 8 or 10, I knew that there's something special there. I couldn't intellectualize it. I didn't have the ability to do that yet. But it was something that was deeply felt, and I knew that. So in the fall of 63, I went out to Art Center School. And I went out there because they had one of the most outstanding illustration programs in the country on the West Coast. School of Visual Arts in New York had the other one. And I went out to study with a guy by the name of John Legata, who none of you that probably doesn't call anything up in your mind. But he was an old Saturday Evening Post illustrator and kind of drew in the manner of he made images oftentimes were about elegant men wearing tuxedos and having drinks with the ladies or attending the opera, that sort of thing. And in some ways, now in my maturity, I see that there was a kind of shallowness about the work, but it was still something that made sense to me. And I got to study with John Legata in his last few years when I was out in Los Angeles. And he was a wonderful old guy. I mean, he was probably in his late 70s, maybe his early 80s by that time. He would stand in the studio and walk around to each individual student and never sit down. And he'd do that for 3 hours, and it was just phenomenal. And he would say things to you that would sort of puzzle you, and they were like little puzzles to try to figure out. I came back out here, and I realized at some point in time I really needed to come back to the Midwest. LA just wasn't my gig, you know? And I had fun in LA. I had a good friend who was in the picture business, was an actor, did television, that sort of thing. So I knew people out there that made things fun out there, but I never felt as though I belonged out there. It was like a stopover for me. And I came back on the train to Wichita to try to decide what I was going to do next. And I was up in the observation car in the early part of the morning, and the sun was coming up, and the train came out of Denver and onto that lovely plain. And the shadows were long and blue, and the whole experience of that absolutely stunned me. And I realized two things. One, I had never seen it quite like that. But also, I had been lucky enough to have a father who was passionate about flying and would take me flying. I started flying with him probably when I was 8. He taught me to fly, I guess, when I was 15. And I began to understand that spatial relationship about being 50 feet above the ground, 100 feet, 200 feet, maybe 500 feet, was something quite special to experience. Most people don't get to do that. When you're flying, if you're just a passenger, and you know, you're in a tube amongst all these other people, you can kind of look out to the left or to the right. But when you're looking straight out and watching the earth move below you, it's really something quite extraordinary. And really extraordinary when you get down low. That's a part of flying that can be a lot of fun. It's incredibly dangerous. And that's where I discovered I was probably an adrenaline junkie. So, yeah. Okay, you want to start showing pictures? You can hold it on each one for, I don't know, 10 seconds. 50. Oh, yeah, okay. All right. There we go. This is a painting from about 10 years ago. It was probably one of my early paintings that kind of took my own breath away when I looked at it in the studio the next day. It's a field in the Platte Valley that I painted on site and painted all in one, alla prima, all at once, from starting at probably 2 o'clock in the afternoon and working until 7 or 8. It was too dark. And I love that sort of thing where I'd go back to the studio and I wouldn't look at it again until the next day when I would be fresh and I would feel that I had distance. The sensation of the experience of glimpsing something remarkable and something that to some people was unremarkable was really exciting to me. And I remember once a student of mine was very, very confused about what he was going to do. What am I going to do? I can't decide what I'm going to do. And I said, why don't you just paint your backyard? And he said, well, I just couldn't possibly do that. I said, why the hell not? It's your backyard. You know it. You probably know every inch of that backyard. And go out there and paint the backyard. And he came back to class a week later and he had this beautiful little painting of this very quiet backyard. It had a little cement in it. There was a doghouse in it. It had all those things that contemporary painters sometimes would sort of sniff at, you know. They didn't think it was quite right, but he really made a good painting. And he understood that. That was a breakthrough moment for him. The thing that I saw, the thing that I saw when I came out of Denver on the plane was that there was a horizon line there. I already knew about that because when you fly, the horizon line is extremely important to you in terms of the position of the nose of the airplane, the wings, you know. It's a lifeline, you know. And so finding that landscape to be something that might be important to me was incredibly exciting to me. it was also a mystery to me that it tugged at me in a way that the commercial work that I was doing just didn't satisfy. I still enjoyed doing commercial work, but at the same time, I realized there were a lot of things that I just wasn't allowed to do because I was really fulfilling the needs of a client and an art director. And that in and of itself was exciting. You know, I really learned to have a habit that was important to me, that to be working in the studio 6 to 8 hours a day and paying attention and buckling down and looking at what I was doing. And I was very lucky. I had a very good art director. I was at Hallmark Cards, had a very good art director, and I was in the early stages of the contemporary design department. Most of you people know Hallmark Cards. Some of you probably bought Hallmark Cards. Yeah, I would hope so. What was interesting about it was that this guy really started the contemporary design idea about cards, that they would have irony, that they wouldn't just be about roses and lambs, you know, prancing through the fields and that sort of thing, but they would have some kind of sense of humor, and a sense of humor that might in some way allow people to enjoy them on a level that wouldn't be just only a level that might have been overly romantic or that sort of thing. It was very interesting to work for this man, and he had a pair of eyes that were just terrific. I mean, he could look at something you were doing, and just within 5 minutes, he could see where the weaknesses were, whether it was color, whether it was color value, whether it was the drawing itself, and those sorts of things. It was an amazing guy, and he was a guy who sort of said to me, you know, I'm going to give you a freelance contract probably in the next 6 months or so, because I think you're going to do better on the outside than in here on the inside. But I learned a lot from him, and he was very conscientious, and he was an art director who wasn't crazed mad about controlling everything. He understood that he would help the artist through these images and coax him, and then, you know, like a good teacher, and you would get to a problem solution that would be exciting. My first year there, I did a card that became a #1 hit on the college hit parade and sold very well. And it was a card in which I had drawn a little nebbish on the front. The nebbish was neither male or female, but looked human. And he had his hand up in the air and his finger in the air. And he says, "The thought for the day, do campus cops eat their young?" If Joyce Hall had had control over that, it would have never gotten. But Joyce Hall ended up having heart problems, and his doctor said, "You've got to get away from Hallmark. Go to Europe for a year." And during that year, this guy just developed this extraordinary group of guys, young and women. I had my first art director, my second art director there was a woman. My first was a male, and it was very, very exciting. The other thing that happened to me that had a lot to do too with how I worked was that I began to start to keep a journal. Now, I did that for 2 reasons. I wanted to figure things out, and secondly, I was lousy I didn't do well in English in high school, but I had an English teacher who I was writing some poetry and saw it and encouraged me and said, "You know, you should continue to write. It's an important thing to do. Keep a journal." So I started keeping a journal, and then all the way through the Art Institute, I would keep it sporadically. But after I left the Art Institute and was on my own and working at Hallmark, I started keeping a journal almost every day, and I've been doing this for years. I'm still keeping a journal. So there's a double page of a journal. And the journals, I think it's a little soft, so it's probably hard for you to read, which is probably okay with me because I was never very good at sentence structure. And when I write, I don't write in a white heat, but I write partly for the joy of it, so I don't worry too much about punctuation and spelling. But I write in pencil, so I can go back and I can erase and I can spell something correctly so people can understand it. I think a journal puts you somewhere between reality and desire. That's the beauty of a journal. You don't have to show it to anybody. And you can work with whatever truth works for you. The world outside of you and the world that's inside of you. Both worlds are interesting. Both worlds are worth a time of contemplation. But what is truly vital is negotiation. You know, that you're willing to negotiate with your own weaknesses in terms of how you're living your life and how you're writing your journal and kinds of things that you're thinking about. It is in the negotiation that one finds mystery and understanding. And I keep a journal not only to answer questions, but to generate more questions. And more questions fire the imagination. I have no set routine. I will write at night. I will write out in the country, and I will also put images in the journal while I'm in the country making drawings. And I'll make a little drawing in the journal and bring it back and add color to it later. And it's the most pleasing thing for me over my morning coffee to go back and read what I read, at times be shocked, at times be maybe a little bit embarrassed, but at the same time, I didn't have to show it to anybody. So that was a very interesting thing to do.
You might
Yeah.
mention to people about this is on paper. This piece
Yeah,
is
right,
on
right.
paper.
Yeah, this is oil on paper. I started out working oil on canvas, and they were fairly good sized, 16 by 20. And then I began to realize that I wanted to finish an image in an afternoon. I got very excited about that. And so I began working on oil on paper. Yeah, I could rub stuff out very quickly, go back in and repaint areas.
And this starts out with a brown ground.
Yeah, and it starts out with there are a number of different browns that I use, and I lay them down so I can put a painting down on top of it, and I don't have to battle that white intensity of the paper. And it's not anything I invented, you know. Corot did it. Cézanne did it. Patricia just mentioned.
What kind of paper do you use?
I use 100% cotton made by Strathmore. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can buy it in any good art store. And I use 3-ply so it doesn't warp. And yeah, just listen. Anytime you have a question, just ask me and I'll do my best. But it is that negotiation that you do when you're painting outside. It's an immensely exciting thing to do. When I first began writing, all those years ago, it was to teach myself to write. And as a kid in school, I spent most of my time drawing in my workbooks and staring out at the schoolroom window because my father was still a test pilot. He started out Beechcraft before the war, went to work for Boeing, flight testing B-29s during the war, had his own flight crew. And I knew he was still out there flying. I mean, I'd be sitting in the classroom, kind of bored, and I would hear an airplane. And I just, in my mind, that was my dad out there, you know. And of course, I was lucky because I got to fly with him. And then I started flying by myself, which was an interesting thing to do. I work with 2 mediums out there, sometimes 3. I work with pencil and watercolor, which is what these are. And of course, this is an oil on paper. But I work out ideas in the journal, and sometimes I work on them outside, but other times I like the ability to be able to take a break once it gets dark. If it starts raining, I can come back and I can work in the journal in the studio in the comfort of the journal. Writing can come from a very distant memory of experiences in childhood, and how I see the world today, and how I've looked at the world for the last 40 years. Walking 2 blocks home from my good friend, Philip Van Kuren, who I think he's out in the audience. We kind of grew up together here in Wichita. I'd walk from, I called him Jim in those days, and I would walk home from his house to my parents' house, and it was maybe a block and a half. And if it was a warm summer night, and this was before people had a lot of air conditioning, the windows would be open, I could hear conversation, I could hear the radio, people were listening to Lum and Abner, you know, just listening to old talk radio, which was new in those days. And the dusky light of evening was something that just absolutely fascinated me. I found it so mysterious and so extraordinary. Still is today. I go out there and sit and watch that all take place.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by your skies, but
Yeah.
the water, what are these strips of water that look like straight lines? I mean,
It's the Platte River, and it's at low water time, usually midsummer.
why would they have straight lines?
Those are like plowed fields,
Well,
some of them.
some of that's actually the Platte River. And I make the straight line sometimes. See, I get to work against nature if I want. And that's all part of this sort of this thing that most painters who are really serious about what they're doing will talk about, which is formalism.
Mm-hmm.
The whole formal idea of structure and making those things
You paint
work.
irrigation ditches.
Yeah, and I paint irrigation. I'll show you some irrigation paint. This is my wife, Paula, by the way.
She's doing a fabulous.
Yeah. So these paintings, I should say something about scale. These paintings will range anywhere from 6 to 12 inches to 6 to 10 feet. And it's exciting to work at all those sizes. I really enjoy that. It excites me. Now, a few words can jog a memory, and that can produce a long paragraph of writing, and that paragraph of writing will send me to the country the next day or within the next 2 or 3 days to sort of go and find this place that I was writing about. And sometimes I find it immediately, and other times I search around. And just recently I had found this copse of trees, absolutely gorgeous. It looked like Corot had painted them. And I gave it a month while I thought about it, and I had other things to do. I had some commissions I needed to work on, and I went back. I couldn't find this place. And I circled around, and I usually in my journal, I'll keep a sort of a rough, in my painting journal, in my mileage journal, I'll sort of keep a rough idea of where I was. And finally I saw a guy out in the field on a tractor, and I stopped, and I was watching him, and he saw that I was watching him, and he stopped, he got off the tractor, and he walked over to me, and he asked me what I was up to, and I said, well, I was out here recently, probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I found this gorgeous copse of trees, and he said, oh, I cut those down. Yeah. But even he said that. When I told him, I said, well, I've been making a painting of him. And, but you know, that's what you gamble with if you're a landscape painter.
You gotta paint a little faster.
You gotta paint, that's right, you gotta paint a little faster. That's exactly right, yeah. So this whole idea of walking home as a kid from Jimmy Van Kuren's house to my house, I really saw twilight, and it really became a real mystery to me, and that's something that I've really pursued. It's been very much a part of my life, these last 40 years. It's that in-between, and it is filled with parody. It's filled with the excitement of the dark coming, and a professor, I think this guy was a professor of anthropology, told me once when he saw what I was doing, this was at KU, he said, you know, you're painting in that time that used to be called the time between dogs and wolves. Whew. Still gives me the shivers when I think about it. The goal is to inform my life, ideas, my visual intelligence, which I hope is continuing to grow, even at my age. Now I'm 77 years old. I paint from observed land, this is observed, and remembered landscapes. I carry with me those remembered landscapes in memory, and that's as rich, as important as being out there in front of what's happening. Form speaks clearly. And I think you can see that here. You can see that the form of this painting is about distance and light and this possibility that this field had just gotten rained on. And so there was standing water. And he had plowed, so there's the straight lines, you know. This guy had plowed these lovely furrows, and it was very, very exciting. Every work of art has a certain responsibility, I believe, to the interpretations that it generates. And that means I make a pact with myself and you, anybody who's going to come and visit a painting of mine, whether it's in a gallery or a museum or come to my studio, that you can have some relationship and understanding of that painting without having necessarily an art history background. Now, if you have art history, it can make it even more relevant and can really make it very full. And I would say to any of you who are interested in the arts that it's a good thing to maybe take an art history class, an evening art history class, and I'm sure you'll find it exciting. I find the longer I work on a painting, the more the mystery deepens of what appearance is and how what is called appearance and transformation in the medium works. It's just paint on surface, folks. But there is this magic if you learn how to make a painting, and it's a painting that you want to describe in an example to other people about that level of interpretation and that level of emotion and that level of interest can in some way inform who is ever looking at it. Now, sometimes it means that you come back and you look at it multiple times. You know, it's like the art museum here has played a really important part in my life because my father took me here every Sunday afternoon. And we would go out and we would go to the art museum, we'd go to the art association, which back in those days was this beautiful big mansion on Belmont Avenue, which I was absolutely sure was haunted. And you know, it was haunted by all those painters. So I do believe that there is a responsibility of the painter, not just only to their own terrific selfish self, but also to maybe help people along if they want to. Now, there are certain painters who would argue that point, and I would be as passionate about that argument that they have as I am about my own. It can happen in a lot of different ways. Some ways the purpose of art is to visualize the invisible. It's the transcendence of a commonplace experience. My students often ask me to define creativity, and I tell them it is the experience of becoming. It's not something anyone can teach you. You either have the heart for it and the mind for it to let it in, or you don't. And that doesn't mean that you're missing it, or you're missing anything if you don't have it. You have other ways to find excitement in your lives. It may not matter how badly or how well an object is formed. It is not necessarily a way to make a living, Painters don't make good livings here in the Midwest. There's just not a market for it. There are not enough collectors to keep a lively market going. But some of you out there are probably buying paintings here, and there are drawings or photographic prints. And in your own way, you're doing exactly that. You are keeping it going. So it's a way to become, you know. Making things is a way to become yourself, to become part of this community that you're living in, and to take the lessons that those things learn. So I would like to, if anybody has questions, I'll go ahead and I'll go through some more of these paintings, and you can look at them. And if you have any particular questions about them or about the journal, just you know, hold up your hand or just shout something out. When I work from the journals, I start them oftentimes outside, just on my, you know, sitting on the back of my Honda CRV and dangling my feet down on the earth and my little journal in my lap, and I'll make a quick sketch. And I'll do that parallel to maybe sometimes a bigger drawing or a bigger watercolor that I'm also working on at this sort of parallel to that. What I love about these paintings is that I have to embrace abstraction because there's not enough time. You know, there's an incredible painter who I have loved all my life. His name's Andrew Wyeth. Most of you who know who Andrew Wyeth is. He took a bad rap almost all the way through his career, especially the abstract expressionists had a hard time with him. Until sometime later when they began to embrace what Wyeth was doing and realize that there was a real genius there. I was watching CBS Sunday Morning. This was, I don't know how many years ago. And de Kooning was on this program, and I can't remember who the guy was on CBS, but he was talking to de Kooning. And de Kooning was looking at a book, and he was saying, look at this form, look how this is described, this tonal range of this painting is absolutely magical. And the camera came around and looked over his shoulder, and he was looking at a Norman Rockwell book. Yeah. He was a real Democrat, wasn't he? I mean, this guy was... He was willing to look at a lot of different things. Yeah. I love these paintings that, like I said, are sort of in that in-between, in that twilight, when I'm heading back. It's a very exciting time for me. And I've got satellite radio, which it's just made a difference in my life that I can't believe. Wonderful, yeah. This is soft, but here's a detail of it. Car moving down the road.
A little water tower.
Yeah, a little water tower. I'm not sure. I think that's Walton in the background. I've had great experiences out there meeting farmers and kids who live at the farms. And farm kids, when they see you down at the end of the road, they're looking for something to do if they've got the chores done. And boy, they'll just suddenly show up. And one day when I was in this white heat of working and I did not want to quit, and I could hear these kids playing, and I was going, oh, please, God, don't let them come down here. And this kid came down with his dog, and he stood there for 4 or 5 minutes. He didn't say a word. And I was trying to decide whether I was going to get irritated and maybe shoo him away or just let him stand there and work with his dog. And suddenly I felt this warmth on my pant leg. He was waiting for that dog to pee on me. He just giggled and ran off, you know. So I'll go through a few more here. So I'm working out, when I'm working in a journal, if I'm not working directly from a source, I'm working out ideas and working out memory, and I have been thinking about doing a series of these verticals, these tall, slender verticals. And that's a very difficult format to work with because most balance comes, well, shouldn't say most, but balance can come more readily to a square or to a rectangle, say a 16 by 20, that sort of thing. So when you have a really extreme vertical, it's so much fun to work with that. It's entertaining. It's from the front porch of the first house Paula and I owned together, and crows at twilight, the time of between dogs and wolves. Another vertical. I quote in my journals a great deal. I read a lot of interesting stuff, and it's informative to me. I mean, I love other people's minds, and I just can't help myself. If I read something interesting, I'm going to write it down in a journal. And it may help me to solve some visual problems, or it just may give me pleasure, which is the most wonderful, selfish thing to have. You know?
Was that a grain bin or something?
No,
What was
that? No.
No, the previous one. Or was that a pyramid?
Nope, that's a barn.
Okay.
It's one of those big A-frame barns, you know. Yeah, twilight. And I particularly like it when it's after rain and things are puddling and you know, the fields are wet. Very exciting. And that's a detail of that painting. That painting is a fairly good-sized painting. And that's a very big painting. I think it's 30 by 70, if I remember correctly. And it's owned by a guy in Lincoln, Nebraska. His name is Bob Duncan. He owns Duncan Aviation, and they fly Lear jets and all kinds of stuff like that. And I got to know Bob when I quit flying at a certain point, and there was a period about 4 or 5 years when I had quit flying, and someone said, you know, you ought to go out to Duncan Aviation and see if there's a flight guy out there, an instructor that'll give you some time, and you can see if you can still handle flying an airplane. And I went out there, and I fell in love with it again, and so I flew for another probably 4 or 5 years. And Bob he bought this painting, and it's now his son has it. His son now owns the flight service out there.
What I always found so fascinating was when I first started looking at your paintings.
Yeah.
That painting could have been 6 inches by 24 inches.
Oh, I like that.
And it would have been the same detail.
Absolutely, I like that.
And it could have
Yeah.
been 70 inches.
Yeah, I like the idea of creating this huge space in a small space. I think that's a very exciting thing to do. Yeah, that's real magic. You know.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
These landscapes, a lot of times there's a very particular sun or a cloud, a sun and a cloud. And how is it that doesn't it take a long time to paint a painting? And that the whole thing will all change during the time you're painting. So
That's
how
true.
do you do that?
That's true.
You take a photograph? and
I
then-
do take photographs out there. Yes, now you know my dirty little secret.
Take a photograph and then go home and paint it.
Oh, well, I might, yeah. But I might just take a photograph because it allows to jog my memory if the painting isn't finished out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah,
Do you know Donald Groller Wilson?
of course I do. Yeah,
And what do you think of his painting?
I think he's wonderful. He's crazy, he's loony, he's just an interesting guy.
He's 3 years older than we are.
Is he really? I haven't heard much from him. There was a period when he had a lot of attention from New York, and I think was doing very well. But he still lives in Oklahoma, as far as I know.
No. He lives in Arkansas, Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Did he? Okay, Fayetteville, that's it. Yeah.
He became head of the art department there.
Uh-huh.
You became head of the art department in Lincoln, Nebraska.
No, I was never head of the art department. I just taught. I didn't have the mind to be head of the art department. Yeah. Yeah, that would have been like Soupy Sales being the head of the art department.
But he's got a huge house there,
Yeah.
and he's got animals in there. You know, he's got monkeys in there.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, he's a marvelous painter. That's true.
Monkeys with matches.
Monkeys with matches, that's right. Okay, I'm going to speed things up here a little bit. It's also a large painting. I think it's probably 30 by 70 again. And that's a detail. Painting these big paintings is it's like carrying on a human relationship with a partner or somebody like that. And sometimes the partner talks back to you and gives you a lovely, warm information, and sometimes the partner talks back to you and says, "What the hell are you doing?" You know. There's a guy who lives outside of Wichita who flies ultralights, and he's caught me out in the field 2 or 3 different times. And he'll fly around me. You know, he'll get down at maybe 100 feet, and he'll fly around me in this little ultralight. It's like a motorcycle with a body on it, you know. And I've never flown one. I've always thought it would just be a delight to fly one of them. And sometimes he'd yell something at me. And sometimes I could hear it, and sometimes I couldn't. But at some point, he finally got through to me, and he yelled an address, and he said, "Come for a drink." A man after my own nature. And I got to know him, and it turned out he was a professor at the university who owned a farm out there and farmed during the summer months. You know, isn't it amazing how something that looks so cold can also feel so warm? It isn't necessarily warm when you're out there working on it, but it's. But I love that. I love the dichotomy of it. And you know, if you think about it, the fact that people are still painting out there, still making images made out of greasy oil, pigment suspended in an oil base, is an extraordinary thing to think about, because it's hundreds of years old. Yeah. I've been working on some fire paintings over the years, and this is one of them. I think maybe I might have more than one here. Quonset huts. I love Quonset huts. And they're beginning to disappear, which really upsets me. There's another thing that really affects me when I'm out there, and that's, of course, there are multiple things that affect me, but the sound of crows has always been something that I think it's an extraordinary thing to hear, because there is a real sense that they're talking about me, you know. And they are, exactly. You know. And I've never had a crow get up really close to me, but I've had crows on fence posts that were maybe 50 feet away, or on a building. There might be 2 or 3 crows on a building. Usually that's a family, and I find that immensely exciting. And my grandmother, Boston, who started out on the prairie when she was born on the prairie in Oklahoma, and she kept crows, pet crows, all the way up until she was old enough to get married, and her husband said, "No more crows. We're not going to do that anymore." Also, something that I think that is extraordinary is that mostly we see trees in abundance. It's a tree line, that sort of thing, but suddenly you'll find a tree that's by itself. And it's that individual tree that who knows, a crow could have pooped out the seed. Certainly a bird could have if it's in the middle of a field like that. So that's all part of how things work out there that are magic. Another After the Rain. That might be the same painting.
No.
No, it's a different one? Okay. My wife knows them better than I do. I just painting. That's Nebraska. Most of these are painted in Nebraska within a 60-mile radius of Lincoln, where I live. I go out and draw and I make watercolors and bring that stuff back, which you saw in the journals. And then I make paintings from those, but I also make them from different fragments of journal pages too. So there could be 4 or 5 little watercolors from separate journal pages that were done over the period of 6 months. And I'll take those, I mean, they'll speak to me in some bizarre language that I don't quite understand, and I'll suddenly understand, oh, this could go with this could go with this. And suddenly they'll begin to take form and life and space and light, and it's a lot of fun. I've got a good friend from years ago, Wolf Kahn, and some of you might know his work. He's a New York painter, marvelous landscape painter. And I brought him to the University of Nebraska 40 years ago to be a visiting artist. And I got to know Wolf, and I would go out and visit him, and he has a studio on a farm in Vermont, and then I'd also visit him in New York. And he said to me once when we were drinking rye whiskey at the table at the farmhouse and getting enjoying ourselves, you know, and Wolf has enormous respect in the art world, not just the local art world, but the art world in New York, and those people who think they're working on a higher plane because they're working in abstraction. And those people love Wolf's work. And I asked Wolf if he's ever been unhappy, you know, I mean, does he have bouts of depression and melancholy? And he says, as long as I can go to the landscape and nature, I'll never be depressed. You know? And he certainly was one of the people who said to me that not to be upset over a painting that's going badly. It's just the painting arguing back with you. It's just the painting making the demands on you that you need to solve. This is a little painting. Actually, I've been working on this painting for probably 2 or 3 years. A guy named Hinkleman owns the farm and has this little shed out in back, and he has cattle. And when I was painting this shed, I've painted 3 or 4 different versions of this shed, but usually the cattle were in another field. And I went out there to draw one afternoon, and Hinkleman said to me, look, I know you want to go out over the hill, but on the other side of the hill, there are 20 head of cattle, and they're going to eventually smell you, and they're going to come and check you out. And so I said, well, I'll look for them, and I didn't think that I would be afraid of them because they're pretty gentle, I thought. And I just got to working, and I got absorbed, and suddenly I heard this odd noise, and I turned around, and there were probably 10 or 15 of these cows in a semicircle behind me, and I swear to God, they were just standing there watching me. You know, I mean, they're entertainment for me, and I'm entertainment for them. It's a lovely time of day, isn't it? I like it when the farmers come and check me out, and it's a real pleasure when they stop to see what I'm doing, because I work fairly close to Omaha at various times, and there are people in Omaha who go out to the country and drink beer and throw the beer cans down on the road, and then the farmer comes along and cleans and so on. And this guy pulled up in his pickup truck, and I could hear it idling, and then all of a sudden he just said to me, "You're working." I said, "Yeah." So I suddenly felt this great kinship, you know. I'm out there working, they're working. They're working for me without even knowing it. Yeah.
That's the same one.
That's the same one, yeah. Here we go. And now some of these places that are closer to Lincoln and closer to Omaha are disappearing. suburbs are going up, and I have to say I'm sort of interested in maybe painting some suburbs that are at a distance from me. They really look terrific in that landscape, and especially those suburbs that are sort of following the curvature of the land, and the realtors and the engineers haven't just cut it down to where it's flat. That's really exciting, you know, that happens. I love it when those guys do that and pay attention and understand that they're creating something quite extraordinary out there. And there are people I know who don't like the suburbs moving out there, but it's just the continued march of time, you know, and there's just nothing we can do about it, really. The big paintings take anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months, and sometimes I'll work on them for maybe 6 or 8 months, and I'll put them away half finished, turn them to the wall, and start something else. And then it'll be in the middle of the afternoon, and I'm petting my cat, you know, and drinking a cup of coffee, and I look over and I see this painting turn to the wall, and I think, oh, I haven't looked at that painting for a while, and I'll turn it around, and it'll surprise me, and it goes up on the easel, and I'll work on it, and usually I'll finish it at that point.
How do you know when you have enough trees?
God, that's a good question. How do I know when I have enough trees? I think it's a formal question in terms of forming.
A lot of trees.
Yeah, I do, yeah.
Lots of them.
Yeah. Well, I go to places where there are a lot of trees. It isn't all just farmland, you know. I mean, it's This is how a painting is started. I work on the sky first. That's sort of the mediator. It somehow informs me emotionally how the painting might ultimately become and look. And I work in raw sienna and raw umber with a lot of turpentine, and I put down a drawing. And I work with big brushes, sometimes, well, big brushes for me. Sometimes they're 5 inches, and they're house painting brushes. They're not expensive artist brushes. They're just good house painting brushes. So I start them out, and they begin that way. They're born that way, and I'm amazed that even though they're monochromatic, they can tell me so much by the time I've finished a drawing.
Should have been before that one. Those should have been reversed.
Do you think so? Okay.
The second one had less detail.
Yeah. That's the town of Greenwood back there. There are these lovely little towns out there, and elevators, and another fire painting. At that time of year when they're cutting out more wood to give themselves another acre or 2 acres, it's a very exciting time, because then they pile it up and then they burn it. And it's visually an incredibly exciting kind of moment. The other thing I want you to do, when you're looking at a painting, I want you to be able to understand that it is paint. I'm not trying to disguise that. I want you to understand that there are those brush marks and those little blobs and those dots and those dashes, and they can form a thing in your imagination, but it's just colored butter, you know, and this was a commission painting in Kansas, just outside of Fort Scott. And that's a family farm of a guy who lives in Switzerland. And he contacted me once, and he said, I'm just longing for that family farm. It's been sold. I don't get to go back to it much anymore because I'm in Switzerland most of the time, and if I'm not in Switzerland, I'm in Berlin, or I'm in, one of those guys, one of those interesting guys who has that kind of life. So he was coming back for a family thing and contacted me and said, "Can you come down to Fort Scott and spend an afternoon with me, and we'll look at the property and maybe you'll want to paint it." And I said, I'll do that. I thought it'd be an interesting adventure. Fort Scott's maybe a couple of hours away from Lincoln. But I went down with enormous agitation and being really nervous that I might have to say to this guy, "I have no interest in this," And if I was going to have to say that, I wanted to say that in the kindest way I possibly could, because I understood that he still had this memory and passion of growing up on that farm. And it turned out that it was just such a nice experience, because he was just a real quality human being, great sense of humor. And we killed a 6-pack of beer on the edge of the field, So I made drawings and finally got this painting done, and eventually it got shipped to Switzerland. And that's a detail from it. I know people talk about flyover country, and I've had people say, "How in the world do you deal with the emptiness of the prairie and the Midwest?" And I said, "Well, that's the beauty of it. It's there are no mountains in the way, and believe me, I've painted mountains and I like painting mountains, but it's dealing with something that's quite simple and complex all at the same time." And I'm always trying to make it interesting to myself, as well as hopefully to people who will see it. Isn't that lovely? Look at, just this little, the cicadas were just coming out when I was painting this. You guys know cicadas, right? Yeah. They're just noisy little buggers, but they make this gorgeous, slightly irritating noise. And there's nothing, well, when we used to let our cats outside, every once in a while, a cat would show up at the front door with a cicada in its mouth, There's that same farm again.
What size is that one?
I think it's 24 by 48.
Yeah, that's that Switzerland one again.
Yeah.
We've got too many of the same ones.
Well, that's all right.
They're worth seeing again.
Absolutely, for me, they are. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you. And I've been painting roads off and on for years. I love the idea that the road goes someplace, and people get on the road for commerce. Some people get on the road to go visit their girlfriends. Some people get on the road because they're hauling grain. Some people get on the road because they just want to be on the road. And I think that's an exciting draw of living here in the Midwest, because it's easy to get on the road. If you're not in the middle of Kansas City. Okay, that's that same shed. I've repainted this shed painting 4 times. Yeah, and I'm still not done with it. It still sits in the studio.
Gosh, look at all that work you did.
I know, I covered it all up.
In that foreground, you
Yeah.
covered all that up?
I did.
Why'd you do that?
I can't answer that question. I don't know. Finicky.
Your signature is different in different paintings. You had lots of words on some of them.
Yeah, the works on paper, which you can't read, unfortunately, because the slides were pretty soft. They're a narration of what was going on that day.
Okay.
Yeah, so they'll talk about a conversation I had with a farmer. They'll talk about maybe a big flock of crows that were down close to the tree line that I was really enjoying listening to.
The work we showed was in the early 80s, and you recorded the weather,
Mm-hmm.
the sounds, the
That's right.
smells.
Yeah.
where
are
you were.
Paper paintings.
Yeah,
These were all on paper.
Yeah.
And they were from what watercolor portfolio, I think, or oil washes.
yeah,
But intricate notes on just what you were thinking and observing while you were painting that.
sure.
The whole border was covered with those.
Yeah,
things.
I don't do that so much anymore, but Ruben, but I think about going back to it.
It was fascinating. It was early in my career, so I was just really touched by all of that.
Sweet. That's nice of you to say that. I appreciate that. I think we're coming to the end here. I'm going to concentrate. I'm going to do a show that I'm going to title Nightfall. I'm going to start to work on it. Actually, when I get back in Lincoln, I'm going to start to work on it. And it's going to be about that lovely time between dogs and wolves, you know, that time that. And when you think about it, you know, we're very modern people. We've come a long way from huddling in caves and building fires to stay warm. And nightfall and the night is still a mysterious time, I think. It is for me. And it's still, night can be scary, you know. Somebody asked me recently why I don't paint tractors and I don't paint columbines, and believe me, I think about it all the time, and I think, oh man, that's going to be really hard. But I'm gonna tackle it eventually.
You can make it really tiny.
I can, yeah. I could do a dot with about 4 dashes, and it'd be a columbine. Yeah. Okay, I think we're. Now, what we've been looking at, the paintings start sometime in the mid-'70s that you were looking at and go all the way through the 80s and the 90s. And this is a fairly recent painting. I think this is 2014, 2000 and maybe 13, something like that. A guy from New York was making a film. His name was Alan Gusso, and he was making a film on landscape painters. And he asked me if I'd be in the film, and I was absolutely knocked over that I was going to be able to do this, and I was going to be a part of this film called A Sense of Place, and it had Wolf Kahn in it. It had Paul Russick, all these guys who I had admired all of my painting life, and I was going to get to be part of that. And so Gusso and I are out. He was a very animated guy, and he was a big thinker, you know. And so Gusso and I are out there with a film crew, and you know, marching around in the mud and going back in the woods, and finally, Alan asked me, out of the kindness of his heart, you know, how do you go about doing this? And I said, well, I don't go about doing this with a guy like you talking to me. You know? So the situation in which I'm in that film is a situation I don't normally have, because normally I'm solitary. And but Alan was a marvelous fellow. He died about 10 years ago, and I miss him because he was so much fun to have as a friend. Okay, is this all beginning to look the same to you? It is to me.
No.
Oh, good. Thanks. Appreciate that. But that lowered plane, you know, that's something that we get very excited about without even knowing it, is that we get to see the horizon a lot. Maybe just driving between Lawrence and Kansas City, you know. And when I was at the Art Institute, the Kansas City Art Institute, there was a guy there from Brooklyn, and just a great guy. He was really an interesting kid and full of vigor, and he said, well, what excites you about living out here? There's nothing out here. And so I took him to the Flint Hills. And he responded in 2 different ways. One, he said it scared the hell out of him to have that much space around and nothing to hide behind. So he had fright and flight, that sensation. Yeah, yeah. But he got used to it, but he moved back to New York.
But in New Jersey, it's like a tunnel of trees.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You can't really see out.
Yeah, yeah. Oftentimes, and we go to New Jersey. Paula's family lives there, and we go to New Jersey fairly regularly. And they're not. I mean, New Jersey, you think mostly of chemical plants and stuff like that, but they live in this lovely part of New Jersey, and it's just poetic landscape all around, and it's a lot of fun to be there. I haven't really made very many paintings in New Jersey, but I could maybe do it. I've made a lot of drawings. Oh, sorry, that's another. Actually, I like seeing some of these again. But
So
Oh.
when you see them, does it remind you of when you were there?
oh yeah,
painting?
yeah, yeah.
You can remember that experience?
I can. And I've always had pretty much positive experiences out there, but on a summer evening when there's just maybe a light wind blowing, I can hear people talking, and they could be a quarter of a mile away. And I've also heard people in anguish, fighting, usually male or female. And God, that's just, I can't decide how that ultimately affects me when I'm, making the painting. I know it affects me, it's there. But it's just life out there.
Oh, that's another repeat.
Yeah. Am I all the way through? Have I started?
I can't remember how.
Okay,
what it
all right,
ends on.
okay. The experience of making a painting is an experience that is unlike anything else you can have. Although you can carve wood, you can do all kinds of things that where you can work with your hands and give you great pleasure and set your mind to work while you're doing it. Making paintings is a very interesting experience, and I've done it all these years, and I hope to continue to do it. I can't imagine giving it up, but there probably will be a day when I will, when my wife will have to drive me out there. I'll be in diapers, but and Sudlow painted. He died, I think, at 90. Maybe he was 93. And he was painting almost all the way up to the last year. He was out there. Barbara, his wife, would drive him out into the country so he could paint. Extraordinary guy. All right, I thank everyone for coming. Thank you.
I'm never drinking the water.
I'm going to now.
Well, welcome home, and thank you. Poetry of Place. We are shifting. Some people are staying for dinner. Some people are shifting off and having dinner elsewhere. As the Murdock Mixology, we are back again on November 21st. The artist Preston Singletary is flying in from the Pacific Northwest in Seattle. Keith, thank you. Keith and Paula, thank you so much for coming and visiting with us. This was eloquent. Appreciate it.